Hello and welcome to this series on Azure Synapse Analytics by Pragmatic Works. My name is Mitchell Pearson and this series is going to be awesome. In this first episode, we want to take a look at what is Azure Synapse Analytics and why do we have it. If you like what you see in this video, make sure to take a look at our on-demand training at Pragmatic Works as well as our live boot camps where you can get a full week deep dive with labs at Azure Synapse Analytics, kind of taking a look at it. We would love to see you there. Now, what I want to do is just dive in and talk about what is and why do we have Azure Synapse Analytics in this first video. So there's still a lot of confusion even today, a couple of years later, on what is Azure Synapse Analytics. And I want to start clearing that up and then go through a series of videos throughout probably the rest of 2022 where we talk in depth about each of those different technologies that exist. So why do we have Azure Synapse Analytics? That's a great question because in a lot of ways, for those of you that might know, a lot of the technologies that are in Azure Synapse Analytics are not necessarily new. They existed in the cloud previous to being put into Azure Synapse Analytics. And so I'm going to talk about why that is. But right now today, we know that analytics and AI is the #1 investment for business leaders, but they still struggle to really maximize their return on investment. And so the question is, as we do a look into that, and of course Microsoft did, right? Microsoft, and this is actually a study by the Harvard Business Review, as they analyze why that is, one of the things that continued to show up is a result of data that's been siloed, right? And this siloed data has always existed. We've always had siloed data within our workspaces as a result of data that exists everywhere. Data that's in SharePoint, data that's in Dynamics, data that's in our on-prem environment or Azure. And so we go to build a report and we're like, I can't really build the report because part of the data I need is over there and part of it's over there. So I can't really get insights into my data, right? That's always existed. But one of the new issues that we have is the Azure cloud gives us access to unprecedented technology that we've never had access to before. If I was working in an on-premises environment back when I was doing consulting for a customer and they wanted to do big data analytics with a parallel data warehouse, they'd have to go out and spend $250,000 on an appliance, right? In the cloud, I can go spin up a big data MPP architecture. We'll talk more about that in this series, but I can spin up a dedicated pool for $1.50 an hour, build a proof of concept, figure out if I like it or not. If I do, I keep going. If I don't, I burn it to the ground, start over, no big deal. If I want to build an ML model and I want to do that in Azure Databricks, I can go over to Azure Databricks. I can spin up a Spark cluster. I can open up a notebook, right? It's awesome. And I can do it for fractions. I mean, literally fractions of a fraction of what it would have cost on-prem. So we have all this technology at our fingertips. And what companies are struggling with today is they have all of these different IT departments or their business intelligence professionals, and those business professionals and those IT professionals are using technology and they're creating siloed data as a result of that technology because now I have all this data and all this results of, the data being stored in all these different locations, and it's hard to bring that together. So as a result of Azure services available, yes, it's an exciting time. Yes, we have unprecedented access to technology, but now it's causing issues like never before because we're having this siloed data within the Azure cloud. So Microsoft said, what are the key elements that you need as a data professional to do your job, right? I know that I'm going to need to do data exploration, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data integration, of course, data integration being that ETL process, real-time business intelligence, and data warehousing. And so how do we take all of these tools and give you the resources, the services, the technology that you need in the cloud without overwhelming you with 10 different options, right? Like, hey, Mitchell, I need to build a data warehouse. And then all of a sudden I give you 10 options and they all have a lot of overlap between them with subtle differences. And you don't know which one to choose. And maybe you wind up going with multiple ones. So that's not what we want. So what Azure Synapse Analytics aims to do is take the core technologies that you need in Azure that help you accomplish the goals that you see on the screen right here, which is data exploration, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data warehousing, data ingestion, so on and so on. So that brings us to the next slide here where you kind of see the entire circle with artificial intelligence, machine learning, data integration, the same things that we talked about before. But now, if we work as a team in a collaborative environment inside of Azure Synapse Analytics, we don't have to worry about that creating silos of data because of a result of technology. And so that is ultimately the aim of Azure Synapse Analytics. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the data platform in Azure as a whole. Now, there's way more to this conversation than what you're going to see on my slide right now, but this kind of breaks down the data platform in Azure, right? And then we'll talk more about the different pieces within Azure Synapse Analytics. So over here on the left, of course, we have all the different data sources that exist. Now, those data sources might be unstructured data, structured data. They might be already in cloud. They might be on-prem, whatever it might be. And so we have this data that's all over our company and our organization in different places. We want to get that data and we want to get it into the cloud. And we ideally want to get it for analytical purposes. We want to get it into a data warehouse, right? We want to get it into a data warehouse where we have that one version of the truth and we can build all of our reports from there. So the way that we get it there, there's a lot of different options available in the cloud. Well, we have two options available inside of Azure Synapse Analytics, two primary options. The first one is going to be pipelines and data flows. Now, I love pipelines and data flows, I have to tell you, because it's very similar to like SSIS on-prem. It's a graphical user interface. It's a low-code environment. It's easy to set up. It's easy to get started with. And that's what I'm used to. That's what I've worked with for many years. My entire consulting career was working with that type of technology. And now I have something similar in the cloud. So pipelines and data flows, which we're going to do a lot of videos on, helps us to take data, move it, transform it, clean it, and then load it in the final destination. But we also have here notebooks. Now, notebooks are really cool. And I've done a lot of work with notebooks over the years. I have a couple classes on our on-demand training on Apache Spark and on Databricks. Notebooks give us the ability to do ETL as well. See, within notebooks, we have Python, Scala, and then .NET. We have Python, Scala, .NET, and Spark SQL within notebooks, within Apache Spark for ASA, within the Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. And within that, there's a lot of capability for actually cleaning and transforming our data. And so we can use notebooks to clean data. Now, notebooks allow us to do a lot of other things as well, right? We can build our ML models, we can train them, we can test them. We can also do things like some kind of small visualizations in there. So notebooks are really, really awesome. Now, once we clean the data up through either a pipeline or through a notebook, we then want to load the data somewhere. Within Azure Synapse Analytics, we have really two options available to us. The first option is going to be our dedicated SQL pool, okay? And so our dedicated SQL pool right here, this is your MPP, massive parallel processing architecture that allows us to really work with big data. Because of the way that it distributes the work that comes in, it allows us to work with big data efficiently. We're going to dive deeper into that here in quite a few videos as well, so make sure you subscribe. Now, down here at the bottom, that's one place to put the data, but sometimes your data, it doesn't really justify big data, right? You don't really want to put it in a dedicated pool because you're not going to have it as part of your data warehouse, or you don't really have enough data that makes sense to go there. So maybe you decide, you know what, I'm going to put it down here in my Azure Data Lake. Now, there's a really cool concept that's been around for a couple of years now around the Azure Data Lake called the Data Lakehouse. This is probably another series of videos that I need to do eventually, but there's plenty of documentation out there right now. The idea with the Data Lakehouse, which is a little bit of a foreign concept to me because I've always worked in a traditional relational database building data warehouses for customers. But the idea behind the Data Lakehouse is that we just put our data in the data lake and we leave it there. And then we can build inside of Azure Synapse Analytics, you can actually build a logical data warehouse with external tables. You can get performance improvement if you put your data in a Parquet file format. There's security. You actually get Azure Active Directory security here. So a lot of the things and a lot of the reasons why we might have gone with a relational database historically are now built into the data lake. We get great performance from querying data. We can build kind of a logical data warehouse. We have security in place. Now, it's still missing some stuff. Don't get me wrong, right? If I really want the absolute best performance, I'm going to put it in a SQL pool. I'm going to have indexing. I'm going to use materialized views. I'm going to do result set caching. There's a lot of features there that can make it faster. But from a cost perspective, right? If I can get everything I need from a data lakehouse, maybe it's worth it instead of getting all those extra features that might cost me more money from putting it in a database. So just keep that in mind. That's another part of conversation that needs to come up at some point. Now, a lot of times, to be honest with you, we're going to use the data lake as a staging layer. We take our data, we dump it in the data lake, and then we move it into the dedicated pool, or maybe we move it somewhere else. you will notice that on this slide, one of the services that's not readily available directly inside of your ASA workspace is actually Azure SQL Database. It doesn't mean that you can't use Azure SQL Database. I still use Azure SQL Database all the time. It is a great platform as a service, but it's just not baked directly into your ASA environment. And then once we do that, and by the way, with SQL Pools, I'll talk about it in a minute, they're serverless and dedicated. We'll come back to that. But then once we've loaded the data in our data lake or our SQL pool, we then of course use everybody's favorite visualization tool, Power BI, to build reports and build dashboards off of the data that we've put into our lake. Now the thing about Power BI is actually built into Azure Synapse Analytics. And so there's some integration there that we're going to talk about in this series as well. How do we connect to our dedicated pool? How do we use serverless compute to connect to our data lake from Power BI Desktop? How do we build reports and edit reports from Power BI? All of that's a great conversation that we definitely need to have at some point in this series. All right. And then one of the things about ASA that I want to talk about now before we jump to the next screen and start talking about these services kind of individually is that the Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. What is Azure Synapse Analytics? Here's the answer for you. It's a unified environment, development environment for your analysts, your engineers, and your data scientists, where they can come together, work on projects collaboratively, and really all of the core services that you need are all in this really clean interface, in this really clean environment, this development workspace. So I can actually create a pipeline that loads a data lake, loads a file into a data lake, flip over to a little tab over here, and I can see the file right there. I can load data into my dedicated pool, and I can flip over to my dedicated pool right there in my workspace and see it. I don't have to go back to Management Studio. I don't have to go back to, the query editor inside of the preview version of Azure Portal. I don't have to go somewhere else. I can see it right there. And so what is Azure Synapse Analytics? It's a unified development environment for your analysts, your engineers, and your scientists. So that's where you go to get your analytics and really get that ROI that we want you to get, right? As part of any kind of data warehousing project. So that right there. Now I want to talk about the individual services real quick, and this is going to kind of help us wrap up this video. And then in the next video, I'm going to show you how to actually go in and provision Azure Synapse Analytics and set up your data lake so that we can then move on to the rest of this series and we can get in there and get our hands dirty. The Azure Data Lake is every single ASA workspace must have a data lake, a primary data lake that is assigned to that Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. The data lake, if I can just give it to you in very simple terms, I like to think about it like a OneDrive account, right? Like a Google Drive or a OneDrive account. Instead of me storing the files on my laptop, I store my files in my OneDrive account. Very convenient, and it works great when I'm moving between different computers that I have. For an enterprise, for a business, for an organization, I want to take the data, instead of keeping it on premises in one of our servers, we're now moving the data and we're just storing it in a Microsoft data center. So instead of me storing the data in my closet over there, I'm taking the data and I'm sending it over to the data center at Microsoft, and they're storing it there where they manage it, and they have people responsible for keeping those servers running, and we don't have to worry about that. So the cloud itself, the cloud is just another building that has a bunch of servers, and we're leaving our data there instead of leaving it here in our little closet, all right? And so that is Azure Data Lake. It's just where we're going to store our files. Now there's a lot of other services available in the data lake that we won't necessarily get into today, like your file shares, your queues, and your tables. All good, but the primary thing we're going to be using is containers, and that's where we store all of our data that we're using for the data platform and for business intelligence. We're also going to get into talking about dedicated pools. Now here's something very important. A lot of people mistake Azure Synapse Analytics with dedicated pools. In fact, I have these conversations with customers all the time. We do a lot of private training on Azure, and we do these boot camps for private customers, and a lot of times I'm having a conversation and they want to learn about pipelines and data flows. And they want to do the training in Data Factory. And I'm like, we don't need to do the training in Data Factory. We can do it in Synapse Analytics because it has that and it has so much more. It's a really cool environment. And they're like, well, we don't need dedicated pools. And so a lot of people still think that if you're in a Synapse Analytics workspace, you have to have a dedicated pool, or that's a requirement. And it's just not. You don't have to have a dedicated pool. It is something that is optional. When you go into your Synapse Analytics workspace, you can create a dedicated pool, which is formerly known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse, but you don't have to have it, okay? So I would recommend that if you're going into the cloud and you're getting started today, that you start with Synapse Analytics. You don't start with Data Factory. There's a couple of key features that are still in Data Factory that are not in Synapse Analytics, like SSIS lift and shift integration runtime. But other than that, almost all of the code base that was Azure Data Factory has been moved over to Azure Synapse Analytics. So I point all of my customers right here to the ASA workspace. Now, what are dedicated pools? I've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but dedicated pools are a big data solution. They are a solution for working with big data. And the reason that it works for big data, specifically for writing large aggregate queries, is because of the way that essentially the underlying architecture. Okay, the underlying architecture of a dedicated pool is that it's designed in such a way to take a query and scale that query out essentially across multiple computers. Now, obviously in the cloud, it's virtualized computers, so they're called compute nodes, but that is essentially the way that it's designed. And this is also, by the way, very similar architecture to like Apache Spark, which is an in-memory, massive parallel processing architecture for big data and machine learning. So that's what this is. Now, when we get to the video later on and we talk about that in this series, I'll dive more into that architecture and talk about that and talk about the distributions and all of that. This is also a relational database. It's a relational database just like your Azure SQL database, just like the relational databases you're used to working with on-prem. And so this is going to work well on a star schema. Star schema being a dimensional model that is a model that we build specifically for analytical purposes. If you're not familiar with the star schema and you work in business intelligence and analytics, I would definitely recommend a couple of different books. I first read the Data Warehouse Toolkit by Ralph Kimball. The second book that I read that I think is even better is called The Star Schema by Christopher Adamson, I believe it is. Really great book. And the reason I like it better than the toolkit originally out of the gate is because it's just easier to read, easier to understand, a little bit less technical, I think, if I remember correctly. But I like the Star Schema book a lot. Now, I've already talked about the fact that this leverages massive parallel processing, and it gives us that capability of running complex queries across petabytes of data. Another service that's available in Azure Synapse Analytics is Notebooks. We talked about this a little bit. Notebooks leverage that open source technology of Apache Spark. And so we can build these serverless Apache Spark pools inside of Azure Synapse Analytics. And when we create a notebook and we're writing Python or Scala or .NET to connect to these various data sources or APIs and bring data in and then clean and transform the data, the compute that is used to process all of that is actually known as Apache Spark. Now, we're going to use these notebooks to do things like connect to data sources, to write data to our dedicated pool, to clean and transform data, to build machine learning models. That's actually what this is a screenshot of right here, is building out and testing and training an ML model in a notebook, right? And so that gives our data scientists access to all those packages that they're familiar with the Apache Spark compute, and then they can build those notebooks right there inside of ASA. All right, so inside of ASA, we also have pipelines and data flows. Pipelines and data flows are just our method of performing ETL, extracting, transforming, and loading data. We're going to pull the data from those various disparate data sources all over the place. We have a lot of built-in connectors through this graphical user interface, this low-code interface that allows us to connect to things like Azure Cosmos DB or our on-prem environment or SharePoint or Dynamics. And we can connect to those different data sources, bring the data in, merge the data together, clean it, transform it, curate it, get it ready for the data warehouse, and then finally load it to its final destination. And so once again, I already have plenty of videos out there on YouTube around pipelines and data flows inside of Azure Data Factory and inside of Azure Synapse. And this is something I'm really passionate about right here. And then finally, we're going to wrap up this video here. Finally, Power BI. Power BI is an incredible tool for self-service business intelligence. Now, today, a lot of times we're using it to discover our data, to connect to the data, transform it, to model it, and then to build visualizations, right? But once we start getting the data into our SQL pool and into our Synapse Analytics workspace in that data lake, we can start connecting from Power BI, and we're not having to do as much data discovery or modeling because hopefully, ideally, the data is already modeled for us. So now we can just build reports. There's a lot of integration that's built into Azure Synapse Analytics for Power BI. And in fact, there's inside of like dedicated pools, there's a lot of key features that can make connections from Power BI when we're connecting to a lot of data, right? So if I have to do a direct live connection to my dedicated pool, they're called direct queries. There's a lot of features built into the dedicated pool to make that more performant and to make that better. things like materialized view, result set caching, right? And so we can take advantage of those things, prioritization, to make sure we get better performance out of Power BI. And so that's that kind of better together story with Power BI and our Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. And I think that right there was the last slide. So this was very abnormal for me when it comes to a video on YouTube. I don't do a lot of PowerPoint slides. I jump right into the demo, but I wanted to lay the foundation for this series because it's going to be great. So if you made it this far, please make sure to like and subscribe. And as always, we'll see you in the next video.